Today I'm going to show you how to make egg bread in your bread machine. Today I'm going to show you how to make egg bread in your bread machine. The ingredients that we need are going to be measurements for a 1.5 pound loaf. If you want to make either smaller or bigger, you can go ahead and adjust the ingredients for it. For the 1.5 pound bread, we're going to need a 1/2 cup of water, 2 eggs, 2 tablespoons of oil, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons salt, 3 cups of flour, and then 1.5 teaspoons of bread machine yeast. I really like using the ones in the jar. I think it's much more economical and it's easier to do. If you're working with a regular yeast like the ones in the packets, you need 2.25 teaspoons, which usually ends up being 1 entire small packet. So now we're going to go ahead and mix everything in. When I blend my ingredients, I do not like to do it actually in the bread machine. I like to take out the container. This will be our bread pan, and I put everything in here first, and then I insert it into the bread machine. So this way I don't have to worry about anything falling down the sides and getting dirty in here. So whenever you are putting ingredients into the bread machine, you really want to do them in the order that the recipe listed, because if you're doing a time delay feature on your machine, we need to make sure that the yeast and the water and the sugar, that they are separated, because when they combine, that's what starts activating the yeast. So it is, because I'm doing it just right away, we're going to turn it on right away, the order I put the ingredients won't really matter. But if you're doing a time delay, you definitely want to put the ingredients in the bread pan in the order that is specified. So we're just going to go ahead and mix everything in, and I'm just going to do it in the order I listed them. So we're going to do the 1/2 cup of water. We're going to put in our 2 eggs, our 2 tablespoons of oil, our 2 tablespoons of sugar, our 1.5 teaspoons salt, and then 3 cups of flour. Now when you're doing flour, I already have 2 cups measured out, so I'm just going to put that in. But when you're measuring flour, because a a bread machine is kind of very exacting with the measurements, we do need to be accurate with how much flour. So when you do a cup of flour, you don't want to just leave it like this. We need to actually take a knife or something and flatten this out so that we get a true 1 cup of flour. And we're going to go ahead and put that in. And then our yeast goes in last. And we're going to use, because I'm using a bread machine yeast, we're going to use 1.5 teaspoons. If you're using a regular yeast packet, it would be either 1 packet or it would be 2.25 teaspoons. So I have a 1/2 teaspoon here, so we're just going to put 3 of these in. 2, 3. Alright, all of our ingredients are now in the pan, so we're going to go ahead now and put the pan into the bread machine. To put our pan back into our bread machine, we're going to lift up the lid, and you'll notice that in here on the 2 sides I have these clips, and if you notice on the pan itself I also have 2 clips. So when I'm putting it in, I'm going to make sure that those 2 clips are facing the spot in the bread machine to connect them. So I'm just going to put them down in, and then you want to push. You'll kind of hear and feel this audible click, and if I pull on this, you'll notice that it's nice and tight. It's not going to go anywhere. You want to make sure you put the holder down, the handle, so it doesn't get in the way, and then we're going to close the lid, and we're going to go to our display. Now that we have our bread pan within the bread machine, we're going to go ahead and turn it on, every bread machine will have at least these two settings. The first one is going to be actually selecting what kind of bread you're going to do, and the other thing is going to be selecting what size bread you want to do. Remember, the ingredients we were doing were for 1.5 pounds today. Again, you can adjust the ingredients depending on what size you want to do it, but you don't want to exceed the capacity of your bread machine. Like mine is 2 pounds is the biggest I can do, so I don't want to try to put 3 pounds worth of ingredients in here, because then it's going to overflow and you'll have problems. So we're going to go ahead, and my menu button here is going to, I'm going to hit until it says number 1 so that I can select just the basic bread. Mine also has the option of color, so whether I want a light, medium, or dark crust, I'm going to select a medium. And then the loaf is going to be the loaf size, so again it's going to be 1.5 pounds. Once that's selected, we're going to go ahead and hit start. You'll actually hear the bread machine starting. And if you open up the lid, you'll notice the knife that's inside has started mixing, so it's starting to mix our ingredients. Also, if you take a look at the display, it says 3 hours, the 2 dots and 00. So the entire process from start to finish with the bread machine, mixing it, kneading it, letting it rise, baking it, is going to take 3 hours. So you don't want to do this like 10 minutes before you're going to leave. The bread machine does have a kind of a warming cycle where at the very end it will usually warm your bread for a little bit after it's done baking. But if you leave it in for hours, it's going to kind of harden, and then it's going to be hard to get out. So try to leave yourself enough time depending on what the bread that you're doing calls for. So right now we're just going to let it sit, and we're going to check back on it in a few minutes. You'll notice after a few rotations the machine starts to speed up and it has that quicker whirling. You want to, once it looks like it's mixed most of the ingredients, we want to take a quick look at it to see the consistency of our dough. When you're looking at it, you can actually touch it, and if it feels kind of springy, then you're okay. If it feels like it's really dry, or if it's too sticky, then this is when we need to add a little bit of water or flour. If it's sticky, then we need to add a little bit more flour. When you're adding flour, you just want to do 1 tablespoon at a time. So if it felt sticky, put in 1 tablespoon, let it mix for a couple more minutes, and then check back on it again. If it still feels sticky, then you want to go ahead and add another tablespoon. But we want to do it a little bit at a time just to make sure that we don't overflour it. If it felt too dry, like there's really no springiness to it, and it kind of like almost sticks to your, not sticks to your finger, but you have like flour on your finger, then it's not moist enough. So we need to add water. In which case, again, add 1 tablespoon of water. Let it go ahead and spin for a couple more minutes and mix it in and see how that looks. If it still feels like it's too powdery, then again, just add another tablespoon of water. But again, we want to do it a little bit at a time so that the dough has enough time to absorb either our flour or our water without becoming overly sticky or too watered down. Actually, this dough is looking pretty good. You can see that there really isn't a lot of extra ingredients all the way down at the bottom. Pretty much everything is staying in the center in my dough, and when I touch it, it actually feels pretty springy. So when I put my finger into it, it kind of leaves a little bit of a dent, but it's not sticky. I don't have any residue on my fingers. It's not powdery. I don't have any flour on my fingers either. So this to me actually looks pretty good. Now this is not a step that you want to skip. You do want to take a look at this, because if you don't catch it now, at the very end, your dough or your bread isn't going to be very good. So it's much more easier to catch it at the beginning. So to me this looks pretty good. So at this point I'm basically done. I'm going to go ahead and put the lid back on, and I'm going to wait until the machine beeps at me to tell me it's done. Once it finishes spinning, it's going to do that a little bit more. Then it's going to sit for a while so the dough can rise a bit. You don't want to keep opening up this lid. It's okay right now because it's still mixing, but once it actually starts baking and rising, we want to leave this on because we don't want to let heat escape. You'll notice that there is a clear window in most bread machines, so if you're curious as to what it looks like, you can take a peek in here, but try to refrain from opening up the lid needlessly. So right now we're done. We're going to wait until the bread machine beeps at me and we're going to check back on it then. Once the bread machine goes off and it tells you it's done, we're going to go ahead and take the pan out of our bread machine, and you want to do it with a oven mitt because this is going to be hot. Go ahead and lift it out, and there's our egg bread. So before we take it out, we're going to take a plastic knife, and you want to do plastic. If you do a metal, it's going to cut the Teflon on here. So we're just going to run a plastic knife around the edge so that way it loosens it up, and then we're going to turn it upside down onto our cutting mat. If you notice that it's not coming out, at the very top, that's where the knife gets attached. This is the blade. So just go ahead and turn that a couple times and it will loosen up the bread and you'll actually feel it pop. So once it's done, there we go. We're going to go ahead and let it rest for a couple minutes before we cut it. And then the other thing you want to do right away is just pour water into your pot. If you let it sit without putting water in here, everything starts to harden and then it's really hard to get the knife out and clean it. So go ahead and put water in right away. Let this sit for 5-10 minutes so it cools, and then we'll come back and cut it. Once our egg bread has cooled for a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and cut it. Now you can go ahead and cut it this way into thick slices, but I kind of have a hard time with it. I find my slices don't come out quite right, and some are kind of lopsided and I don't get through and it kind of falls apart. So my preference is cutting it in half. There you go. You can see it's nicely cooked. This part down here will always look a little bit funny because this is where the blade is in. So if you don't want it there, you can always kind of cut it off this way so that it looks prettier if you're going for a presentation. Then to cut it into slices, I'm going to lay this down on the side, and then I'm going to cut slices this way. And I just personally, I find it a little bit easier to deal with. I don't have to put my knife through like 6 inches. And I just like the way it comes out, and it still works nicely for a sandwich or dipping into olive oil or whatever you like to do with your bread, or just eat it fresh. And there you go.